Good day, everyone. I'm Karen Bonadio, Director of Alumni Relations. Thank you today for joining us for our webinar, What Does It Mean to Have a Strong Multiracial Democracy, with Professor Archon Fung and Khalil Gibran Mohammed. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Diversity and Enrollment Committee of the HKS Alumni Board. The objective of this newest committee to the board is to improve diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at HKS. I'm happy to welcome both of our faculty speakers so we can kick off today's very important discussion. Khalil and Archon.
Great.
Archon, why don't you get us started?
Great. All right. Hi, my name is Archon Fung. I'm a faculty member at the Kennedy School. I'm a political scientist and democratic theorist, and I am the director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. And I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Khalil Mohammed. Khalil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Archon. Archon is the director of the Ash Center, and the Ash Center hosts the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, of which I am the faculty director. My name is Khalil Gibran Mohammed. It's a real honor to welcome all of you as alumni of HKS to this conversation. I am in my 7th year at the Kennedy School and part of a growing cohort of faculty who are focused in the curriculum on teaching about race and racism as a matter of history and contemporary public policy, and of course, large questions about the health and welfare of American democracy. It's great to be here today.
Great, excellent. And thanks everyone for joining us. This is an exciting conversation. I am primarily a scholar of democracy. Khalil has studied many things with a special focus on race and politics in America. And so it's very exciting to bring together these thoughts about race and about democracy in America now and in history. And so I thought I'd start out just by asking a general question to Khalil. So Khalil, you spent many years and a lot of energy studying the politics of race in the United States in both history and in the current context. So to start off the conversation, what are the ways, looking back in history, in which you've seen racial conflict on one hand and racial solidarity on the other, either set back or advance the cause of small d democracy in the United States?
Sure. Well, it's a good question. And I think for me as a historian, it's important to set at least some framing context. I think that while it may not be true for our alumni community, it is certainly true in the broader American community and indeed global community who has some sense of American history. I get to teach half the MPP cohort these days. And what is often misunderstood is this notion that race or racism is a kind of aberrational feature of American democracy, that it's somehow the exception that proves the rule. Indeed, in so many ways, and I'll just highlight a few, race was fundamental to how the founders and other European colonizers understood themselves in the 18th century when the nation was founded. Just a few quick examples. So first of all, by the time of the US founding in the colonial period, the very problem of slavery and the conquest of indigenous lands were understood in very clear and unadulterated terms as a project of European civilization, to put that land to productive use and to harness the labor power of enslaved Africans was seen as an advance of civilization. The problem became how to articulate the advance of civilization at the expense of inferior groups when you are founding a democratic republic on the basis of universal liberty and rights. And so that conundrum that emerges in the revolutionary period, which Thomas Jefferson himself tries to raise in the Declaration of Independence, which is later struck from the Declaration of Independence, the very metaphor of slavery as the enslaved of the American patriots to the British Crown, created this massive problem. And so the way that our founders solved that problem was to say, well, these people aren't worthy of citizenship. They are not the same people in terms of their capacity for self-governance as we are. And hence, while acknowledging their personhood in the Constitution, there's no mention of slavery, for example, personhood is affirmed within the construct of American democracy, the 3/5 clause for the purposes of electoral college representation as well as congressional representation. So when you ask the question about how racial conflict or solidarity advance or don't advance the American project, first we have to recognize that conflict or solidarity are not these moments where we've either gone wrong or we've come together, but indeed moments where we've responded to the fundamentals of our political nation. And I would argue that for the most part, racial progress in this country has been a consequence of conflict generated by people attempting to expand the boundaries of racial democracy. That is to say, as African Americans themselves sought abolition, fought against the Confederacy, first in their individual acts of freedom, and secondly, in support of the Civil War, which has a long backstory, but essentially was to prevent the expansion of slavery once the 11 Confederate states seceded. That moment that we can now praise as a moment of racial progress that gave us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or the second founding or Reconstruction Amendments, came at a cost of 750,000 lives. So the notion of progress is often a response to the challenge, and indeed in this case, a revolutionary or violent challenge that ultimately resolved in the new possibility of a new nation. I will then lastly say, just on this first question, that if we are to think about the legacy effects of this tension between challenging the existing limitations of American democracy and wondering where are those moments of racial solidarity that we can point to, well, certainly the most obvious one would be the civil rights era. But the mistake we make in the context of the civil rights movement's racial solidarity is that it was only ever a small percentage of the white population that accepted the costs of the civil rights era. What do I mean by that? That is, people who put their bodies on the line, people who put their money on the line, and people ultimately who were willing to sustain the long-term change required for making the possibilities of sustainable multiracial democracy real. We instead saw that racial solidarity led to a backlash in the post-civil rights era, a backlash that saw the efforts in the northern cities, which weren't fighting for the franchise, but were in fighting for the real economic and political inclusion in a society steeped in power and inequality. When that happened, we built the biggest prison system the world has ever known. So it's impossible, in a sense, to look at possibilities for racial solidarity that themselves, that in and of themselves did not produce certain kinds of backlash. So that's the history, Archon, but I have a question for you.
Great.
Yeah.
I have some follow-up, but ask me something and then we'll have
well, you can follow up in your answer.
We'll mix it up.
So you are a democratic political theorist, and obviously, as a person who's steeped both in philosophy and political science, history is an essential basis for understanding how to imagine normative values, how to prescribe policy choices, how to train and help people to think about participatory democracy. And so my question for you is, if I stopped at the civil rights era, a period which precedes both of us in terms of when we were born, and your work picks up in the early 2000s, what have you learned from your body of work about how to make participatory democracy real in a very messy country such as ours?
That's a great question. So as Khalil mentioned, I've been thinking about and studying participatory democracy for most of my career. That's what the vast majority of my scholarship is about. And maybe I'll begin with the other way, a very micro story. And Khalil went through vast swaths of history in just a fascinating way. When I was a graduate student, I was doing some research on the South Side of Chicago in the 1990s and early 2000s. And they had initiated at the behest, actually, of some adversarial community organizations that were demanding more police accountability to communities. They'd initiated a community policing program, and the outlines of that program were that the police would have to meet with members of the community every month and talk about what concerns people in the community, the people in particular neighborhoods in these 200 beats in Chicago had, and what the police were doing about that. And the police were supposed to work on some of the priorities that were important to people in the neighborhoods. And one of the most interesting cases in my research at that moment was I was looking at this neighborhood that was mixed race, and part of it was relatively low income and African American predominantly, and the other part of it was middle income. I wouldn't say it was wealthy, but it was definitely middle income and much more white than the African American part of the neighborhood. And they would have to go to the same meetings. And for the first part of the meetings that I observed for like 6 months, a half a year, the African American residents were just getting no hearing from the police at all. There were far more problems on that side of the neighborhood by my lights. I'd spent some time looking at all the different corners of the neighborhood. But the white residents from the different part of the neighborhood really dominated the conversations, got all of the attention from the city bureaucracy, from city services and the police officers. And I thought, well, this is how a lot of this goes, is there's inequality in society, racial and economic. And when you throw people together, the people who are better off, better educated, have more time on their hands, more professional, are gonna carry the day. But then something interesting happened for the last part of the case, where the last part of the time I was in Chicago. It really changed. Very same neighborhood, same people going to the meetings, and all of a sudden the treatment, the voices that were being heard, and the responsiveness from the city got a lot more even-handed. And what happened was that in that period, much more attention, much more of the conversation was about the difficulties that were happening in this lower income African-American side of the neighborhood. And so what happened was they changed the way that they were having discussions. So it was interesting. So in the first part, it was kind of a free-for-all. And so whoever talks the loudest gets the attention. And that was the people who felt very comfortable in those meetings. In the second part of it, an amazing woman, she happened to be Caucasian, she was a white woman, took up the job of being the facilitator of these monthly meetings. And she went through a much more structured process. And she said, okay, well, we're all here. What do we think are the most important parts of the neighborhood and problems in the neighborhood? And the white folks would say, well, it's kids staying up late at the Dunkin' Donuts. They're keeping me up. And on the African-American side of the neighborhood, it was like, well, a couple people got shot here last month. And then they said, well, okay, which problems do we think are more important? The couple blocks that have a lot of violence and insecurity and assault, or the loud kids at the Dunkin' Donuts? Where do we want to devote more attention here? And everybody agreed, once it was put that way, the white folks in one part of the neighborhood and black folks on the other side of the neighborhood, that the most serious problems had to do with these parts in the African-American neighborhood where the residents were pretty worried about going outside because a couple people had been shot and killed earlier that year. And so what you could look at, just if you were only there for the first half of the period, you could say, well, white people have their interest on one side of the neighborhood, black people have their interest on the other side of the neighborhood, the white people have more power, they're going to get more out of participatory democracy. That's a very common story that's told. And what was interesting to me in the second part is that there was greater racial solidarity once people were asked the right question, which is, what are the most important problems in this neighborhood, and can we agree to it? Now, that's kind of a happy story. A lot of stories are much less happy than that, but it kind of teaches me a bigger lesson that if you structure the conversation in democracy, whether it's at the national level or at the very local level, in this case, a single neighborhood, you can get very, very different outcomes. Some of them can reinforce racial domination and subordination, and some can tend toward what Heather McGhee calls the solidarity dividend across racial lines.
Yeah. No, that's a fascinating story. I will tell you, as someone, some of our alumni know, my specialization is criminal justice, and happened to just help to publish a co-chaired consensus study by the National Academies on how to reduce racial inequalities in the criminal justice system. And on the point about racial solidarity, on the question of dealing with violence in the same neighborhood, it's an interesting example, and yet partly what I would wonder within the frame of participatory democracy is that crime fears and moral panics about Black crime in particular actually have been a unifying democratic force in society. And the problem isn't so much that people could agree on stopping the violence, so much as they might not agree on whether that should be a police job or a labor market solution or a housing solution or a mental health services solution. And so even thinking about the post-George Floyd 2020 moment when participatory democracy was everywhere and people were making demands at the local level at all sorts of, within all sorts of political contexts, the whole thing to some degree fell apart on that very question. Everyone could agree that stopping police violence was a good thing and stopping the killing of people within or community-based violence. But we actually saw much less agreement on this question of how to do both without police being the central instrument of change. Anyway, I think a way for us to think through like how different perspectives complicate, as you say, how you understand what the question is that is being asked in terms of democracy itself.
I totally agree. I wanted to come back to this, very relevant to both parts of the discussion, and we can talk about it at the micro level or at the historical level. I was going to ask you what you thought makes the difference between moments of racial solidarity and moments of racial conflict, in that, in the civil rights, in the Civil War, a lot of the hundreds of thousands, near 1 million people died were white. We're not, we're not Black. In the civil rights movement, as you very rightly say, the leadership and the heavy lifting was African-American people and communities in the South, with some white allies, a lot of, like, our friend and colleague Marshall Gans and others. But then you have in the other parts of the country in the civil rights movement, allies who are not directly engaged, but who are at least sympathetic, white voters and constituents in the North and in the West who are sympathetic to the injustice that's being lifted up by the drama of the civil rights movement, and say, the structure of white supremacy in the South, probably we should be against that. And they probably didn't think about it one way or another until they were awakened to that fact by the civil rights movement. But once awakened to it, they join a little bit as allies, at least enough at the voting box, enough at the ballot box, enough to make Lyndon Johnson say, okay, well, let's do the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So there we see some moments like that in which there's solidarity and alliance. And then, as you rightly say, very rightly say, we see other moments in which there's backlash and in which there's the conflict generates racial conflict and separation rather than solidarity. So what flips the switch?
Well, I think what flips the switch to some degree is a kind of symbolic innocence. And what I mean by that is, as long as Black people, or in some instances, other groups of color, can claim the moral high ground in the face of a kind of regenerate or degenerate, I should say, white supremacy, there have been majority populations of whites in favor of justice. The problem is that innocence only gets you so far. And so that's why the story of Northern racism, the story of redlining, for example, is the unfinished business of racial equality and racial equity in this country. Because it wasn't a story about innocence. It was a story about privilege and power, about who got to decide who lives where and what their property values are, what schools their children attend. One of the lesser known chapters of the civil rights story is that when the Civil Rights Bill was being written by legislators, they had a carve out to protect existing educational segregation from the potential for the same desegregation requirements pointed to the South from the North. And this was partly resolved as a result of the repeal of busing as a policy response, and Boston being a case study in this. So I think part of what brings us to this conversation today is taking stock of the limitations of our traditional model of what racial solidarity looked like, either in the Civil War era or in the Civil Rights Movement era, and to suggest that this moment in 2020, which saw something like 15 to 25 million people participating in street protests, most of them white, the vast majority of them white, has been met with a kind of legislative response at the state level to make it harder to protest. Civil liberties, to some degree, have been under assault in places like Florida, where they enhance penalties against assault of police officers, which of course just gives more discretion for accusations of assault rather than making sure that civil liberties are actually being protected. Even speech itself around race and racism within certain educational contexts has now been outlawed. So we're seeing that the moment of solidarity that played out on our television screens has been met either with legislative action to curtail the possibility of that in the future, or what I would argue is even more silence within broader white communities that have sort of taken their marbles and gone back home. And sort of we're stuck with what we have politically, which is a democracy that is teetering on the edge of being sustainable.
Yeah.
I just want to say, as a plug for the work that IRA does, IRA's interests are in rewiring how people who spend most of their time in the workplace, outside of their political habits, meaning what they do in the polling booth, or how they think about their own individual agency with their parenting or with their volunteer work. I want to ask people to think about what they do at work every day, because we have this gigantic civil society, this private sector, a nonprofit sector, where so much of the kind of bone and marrow of structural inequality in our country is left to the devices of individual institutional leaders to decide how much diversity, how much equity, how much anti-racism, how much hiring, how much retention, how much promotion. They just kind of get to do it as they want. And I think that if we can focus on that, we can change how people think about our collective responsibility to each other. We can actually begin to change our politics.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So a couple of things. One is, as a small d Democrat, I would look at the IRA project and think, well, that's great. It goes further when African-American employees or managers or people who aren't African-American who value racial justice and inclusion have more influence in the workplace to push that agenda forward, right? So, I mean,
Absolutely.
for Democrat power is really, really important. and so, I think you may well agree with that, but yeah, I just
No, I do. I
wonder.
mean, I think the Kennedy School is a perfect example. We have our own equity coalition, which was a choice that students made a few years ago to shift from their individual affinity groups, say the Asian American affinity group, the LGBTQ affinity group, the Black affinity group, and to say, let's form a coalition, a form of participatory democracy on the basis of solidarity. And let's bring our shared interest to the table of the administration in an effort to be able to push for more equity in terms of curriculum, admissions, even student governance itself. And they've been quite successful at it. So even in our own backyard, we have a really good example of this.
Yeah, that's great. And I just wanted to put a plug in for thinking about the institutions and the rules of the game here. And it's oftentimes easy in conversations to think, well, it's the movements or it's something about racial interests and divides that's doing all the work and producing the outcomes that we see. And I think that's really, really important. For sure, those things do a lot of work. but the rules of the game do a lot of work too. And so I want to offer a couple examples of that. One kind of goes to the George Floyd and post George Floyd moment in Florida and what you're saying about the part of the backlash, right? So several years ago, there was an amazing campaign in Florida to re-enfranchise people who have been convicted. And it was a popular referendum that won with a very large majority. Many of the voters who supported that re-enfranchisement were white voters. Otherwise, you couldn't get that much of a majority, right? And then what happened a couple of years later, the Florida legislature passes a bunch of laws to basically roll that back. And one of the most effectively pernicious ones is requiring, before you can vote, you have to make sure that all of your fines, if you owe any money to state and local government, are paid off. It turns out, if you're in Florida, I didn't know this, it's very, very difficult to figure out if and how much money you owe. So you might think, well, I paid everything off, I'm going to go vote. And then later on, somebody knocks on your door and say, hey, you've committed a crime because you voted without paying off the money, right? And so that's, in my view, a very, very bad set of laws, but it really makes a difference where the fight and the decision plays out. So you get one set of results, which is felon re-enfranchisement, if it's at the popular level, at least in this case, through a ballot measure. And then you get a very, very different opposite result if you ask the question and it's the state legislature that gets to decide.
Yeah.
And then I want to offer another tiny example. In part, it's my friend and former colleague, Lonnie Guinier, passed away about a year ago, a little bit more. And she wrote, one of the great articles that she wrote was called Second Proms and Second Primaries. And so for those of you interested in race and democracy in the United States, the primary strategy for getting more, especially Black representation in state legislatures and especially in the US Congress has been through race-conscious redistricting, right? And that's basically become unconstitutional now because of several Supreme Court decisions. But Lonnie, Professor Guinier, was never a fan of this strategy because she thought that it really reinforced the idea that Black communities have certain interests and white communities have certain interests. And so you get Black representatives and white representatives. She favored a set of rules that would mix things up more. And so her analogy in this article called Second Proms and Second Primaries was to a high school that she looked at in which the white kids wanted a very different playlist at their prom than the Black kids. And there were more white kids than Black kids. So if you just put it to a vote by majority rule, it's the white playlist. And the Black kids didn't like that very much. And they ended up having a different prom just for the African-American students at this high school. Lonnie thought that's a terrible result for all sorts of reasons. One, it's a racially segregated prom. Probably, like, she didn't go into this, but probably the African-American kids' prom was less nice, less resources than the white kids' prom. And so she said, well, if you just change the rules of the game, it would be much better. So what if you, say you have 20 songs that night at the prom, give everybody 20 votes, and they get to vote for whatever songs they want. And she thought that rule change would allow a good mix of the playlist of songs that African-American kids wanted and the white kids wanted. So she was always thinking about changes to the political rules that would create a more multiracial pluralist system in which people could, whether the majority or minority groups, really defend their interests, but in which they could also discover solidarities with people of different racial groups. So a little tribute to Lonnie, who I think
it's a great
is one of the most important scholars.
I love the theoretical construct. The thing that I want to emphasize about our work at IRA on this point is, most people who particularly work in the business world sort of know the mantra that culture eats policy any day. And so if we have a policy problem of rule setting in our local, state, and national government, which are still dominated by a white majority population and will certainly enhanced by a white elite whose financial resources tip the scales to their interests, whether they are racially informed or economically informed or some combination of the two. It seems we actually can't get to the kind of small d democratic expression of majority positions, including on abortion, for example, with a Senate that favors Wyoming as much as it does California, an electoral college that doesn't support one person, one vote, and any number of rules around gerrymandering in legislative districts around the country that favor small rural voters over urban voters. So you actually have a problem of changing the rules to extend democracy. And it just seems to me that there aren't enough people whose cultural commitments to full democracy are motivated to vote out people who would actually change the rules in favor of more democracy as opposed to a restriction of democracy. Or it could just be purely geographic, and that all the people who want more democracy just need to move around some more. So
that's very expensive.
they need to move to Wyoming in order to get there. So just to emphasize a point, our work at IRA is interested in how do you change culture organizationally so that you reach people at scale where they spend most of their time. If you can get institutions to change, even like the Kennedy School, some people know has made a number of changes. Harvard is making a number of changes. The impact of those changes, both within the Kennedy School and within Harvard, have a multiplier effect on the people who are within these institutions that will carry those changes into all walks of life. And so while we all sit and wait for the next electoral contest, whether it's local, state, or federal government, and we're all hoping that the outcome, the win-lose strategy of one party over another gets us to the promised land, there's all this work that can be done every day in the places where we spend most of our time. So anyway, that's just a plug for for what we do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think democracy works, and multiracial democracy works, and requires a democratic culture at all of these different levels, whether you're thinking about voting for the president of the United States, or what you do in your school as a parent, or in your workplace as an employee or a manager, and it has to scale through, or in your church, or in your bicycling club, or whatever it is, right? I very much agree with that. I want to just respond just briefly. It's a little hard to tell whether, well, first of all, I completely agree. Our Constitution is, 250 years old. You wouldn't drive a 250-year-old car. You'd try to update it a little bit, right? I think we should try to update ours a little bit. As you know, the most significant amendment to the U.S., or the last significant amendment, substantive amendment to the U.S. Constitution, was 50 years ago, lowering the voting age to 18. That was before the internet, or electric cars, or cell phones, right? It's like our Constitution is slower to adapt than most others in other democracies in the world. So I completely agree with that. What I may depart a little bit from, and I think it's a little bit hard to answer, is whether the resistance to changing these rules lies in a recalcitrant part of the electorate, or whether it's political elites, or whether it's both and. And, on some questions, the majority of Americans really think there should be more than two parties. People leading the two parties think that there should only be two parties, right? So if you just put it to a national referendum, or I think a referendum in just about any state, you'd get more than two parties, right? And so there's a number of changes like that where the interest of incumbent political elites, both Republican and Democrat, favor the existing rules of the game, including many minority rule provisions of those rules, much more than if you asked the ordinary American or the electorate. And so I think that And in places where you've seen significant political reform, like the establishment of independent redistricting commissions, it's almost always been through a popular ballot measure rather than through the state legislature, which makes a lot of sense because people who are in the state legislature kind of like the districts that got them elected there and do not like the idea of an independent redistricting commission mucking around with those maps.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those are important caveats, although, I mean, since I'm not a political scientist, I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of how voters express their preferences in polling data. Not to say that I don't follow or learn something from them. I just think that we live in a culture where people are very self-conscious about what the right answers are.
Yeah.
And their behavior in terms of how they live their lives and the choices they make are quite at odds with much of what they express publicly. So
Yes.
I think there may be a greater gap what people are really willing to accept in the way of like structural change than what they're willing to say in a poll.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. Good.
So I think we may be time for Q&A. We've got 20 minutes left.
Yeah.
So thank you, Professor Muhammad and Professor Fung, for this dynamic conversation. We're now going to open it up to questions. So please note this webinar is recorded and will be posted later online. To ask a question, we ask participants to use the raise hand function. Kristen Reserve will notify you when it's your turn to speak. And you may experience a short lag time, so please be sure to take yourself off mute and turn your video on when prompted. We would appreciate if you could state your name, degree, and year before you ask your questions. And please remember that all questions must end in a question mark. So we're going to kick things off with Daniel Koroma. And apologies if I pronounced your name incorrectly.
No, that's okay. Some people have really butchered my last name. Just don't call me the pandemic. Good afternoon, everyone. Dana Koroma. I'm in Maryland. I was part of the executive leadership program in 2015. This is a very interesting topic to me because I'm a first-generation immigrant. Actually, I was born in Sierra Leone and I'm now here in the US. So my question is, how do we address the economic inequalities or inequities of racism? And I come to this question because of course, generational wealth and multi-generational poverty. And I feel like there are people stuck in the middle. Racism has caused those people to stuck in the middle where they're not able to build generational wealth and they are stuck. They don't make enough to benefit from the safety net services we have. So how do we address the economic, again, inequalities of racism? Yeah. Thank you.
I'm happy to go first, Archon, if you don't
Great.
mind. Yeah.
Please.
So it's a great question, Daniel, and thank you so much for asking it. First, I think there are a couple things that help to understand the construct that we live with. And that is that if you were to just teleport back 100 years and listen to leading economic theorists of the time, and much of the way that the country was motivated, this is the great roaring era of the 1920s, laissez-faire capitalism articulated a point of view that wealth accumulation amongst people who were understood to be exceptional in their talents, often mapped onto other understandings of groups of people as being superior by nature in an era of so-called social Darwinism, inequality was a good thing, meaning greater wealth accumulation was a sign of maximizing the profit and earnings of people who were generating things in the world. So the era of Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and others was understood to be the way that capitalism increased the standard of living in society. I think that's really important because I would argue that we still live with that mentality. We still live with the understanding that capitalists ought to maximize their earnings for the purposes of creating things that we all benefit from. And so our standard of living increases as a result of their wealth accumulation, and therefore everybody wins. This is the standard argument that still lives with us. Sometimes we call it neoliberalism today. The consequence of that is that inherited patterns of inequality are unchanged by that mentality. And so in a time of formal segregation to exclude Black and brown or Mexican people from home ownership in parts of the country, to keep Japanese or Chinese from owning land or having been displaced of their land, meant that for periods of generations, those groups had fallen behind in terms of their capacity to generate wealth under the existing rules of our society. And that's not going to change. Every economic model suggests, particularly for Blacks and certain Latino populations, that will not change if given the status quo. The only way to interrupt those changes would be a policy intervention akin to either guaranteed income for targeted populations or baby bonds, which is another idea that have been floated. And then the last policy intervention I'll mention is relative to European liberal democracies. It is a fact that they simply have many more universal policies of a social welfare system, whether it's universal health care or pre-K education or subsidized daycare for working parents, that we simply don't have. Our means-tested system is itself thoroughly racialized within this country. So those are ways that we could actually make decisions that would, over a long term, begin to chip away at the inequalities that exist within our economic system.
Oh, that's excellent. I just want to add one. I agree with the policy recommendation. I just want to add a little bit to the political justification. So I've done this. If you ask your average MPP class, right, if you have $1 million and you want to do something good with it, do you target it toward, you could say poor people, African-American group that's been racially discriminated against and is therefore facing racial wealth gap challenges? Or do you spread it around and take some more universalist approach, like a smaller UBI for everyone, right? And vast majorities of MPP students say, of course, you should target, because that is the efficient way to get people up the ladder more quickly with the limited amount of resources you have. And then I say, no, you want a little bit less, but you want to spread it around. And why is that? It's a political reason. So the most poverty reducing and long-lived program in the US welfare state, such as it is Social Security, which is a universal program or has progressive features. But the political difference is that everybody has a little bit of interest in maintaining Social Security. And that's why it's very, very difficult to get rid of. If you have a policy that is targeted toward the poorest 5% or the poorest 10% of the population, or a policy that endures and is very focused on the racial wealth gap, it might be the right and just thing to do. I just worry that it won't be politically sustainable because the vast majority of the population will vote it down because they don't get anything out of it. So on sustainability grounds, I would prefer a universal program that has these progressive features that everybody can in their head say, yeah, I'm support this because at least I get something out of it.
Thank you, guys. My only fears is that I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think it's going to take time, because we see white supremacists are challenging even basic construct of fairness, saying, well, if you do this for this group, you have to do it for us. So I don't know, but I'm still hopeful. Hopefully we'll get there one day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Daniel. The next question comes from Thomas Lloyd Smith. Since we're having some technical difficulties, we'll move on to the next question.
Oh, wait, he's on.
Thomas is there.
Nope, I made it through, and I'm happy that I did. And thanks very much for the conversation. I thought it was very interesting. I did have a question, because I do feel in our current political environment, one of the things I wonder about is where is the place for African-Americans who have strong religious beliefs and find, oh, well, there are a number of things that they hear on the conservative side that appeal to them, but then have also strong progressive beliefs in terms of things like police reform or racial equity. And I feel like you're kind of in a no man's land when that stuff comes, because I feel like we've gone through a long phase in our history where religion's been de-emphasized. And now it's we're seeing some sort of resurgence. So I'm just curious, do you think there is a place for people who have those sorts of beliefs that don't fit neatly into all of the categories of any particular political group?
Archon, your turn to go first.
Yeah. Thomas, I think that's a really good challenge. And I think that, my own position is that I would very much like to see more than two parties in the United States. I think a huge part of our political challenges now have to do with political polarization. And part of that polarization is there's two choices, A and B. And a lot of people would like to mix it up a little bit, right? If there were four parties, if there was a Romney Cheney and a Trump DeSantis and an AOC Bernie and a Biden Harris party, I think that people would be able to make some of these more choices that cross the blue-red lines that we see and mix and match in just a much more constructive way. You might find people who are socially conservative but economically populist and have religious beliefs that way, and they should have political voice. There should be a representative that they can choose that stands for the values that they have. But right now, given our two-party duopoly in the political arena, a lot of people can't make those choices. And that's a very unfortunate thing. Only the United States and Hungary among democracies have two effective parties, according to research by Lee Dretman. Every other democracy has more than two effective parties. It's one of these features of our system, which I consider not modern.
Yeah, I like the emphasis, Archon. I don't have much more to add. I mean, I will say, admittedly, I think that the range of issues, as Archon suggested, that people are voting on could be better expressed in different party arrangements. And so I think that's a solution. But I also worry that the tradition of American religious beliefs within the context of partisan politics has done more harm than good. And so that's just sort of my hesitancy and anxiety about leading even more with religion, be it in the form of a formal party, rather than the values that people who are God-fearing actually uphold, which we can talk about as those values. So that's, I don't know that I disagree with Archon at all about the party formation. I just think there's something about religion also that is deeply troublesome in our political culture as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. The next question comes from Marvin Benton.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We just had a situation about a year or so ago at the Capitol on January 6th, which I think for many of us was very troubling. I would like to get both you all's reactions to the January 6th situation at the Capitol, and more particularly as we talk about participatory democracy and multiracial democracy. My view of what happened there is that it would have been different if most of the protesters there had been people of color. My view is that the law enforcement personnel that were there at the time displayed a great deal of restraint in their use of force. And I would just like to get your reaction that if the composition of the people that were on the Capitol on that day had been people of color, do you think that the reaction by law enforcement would have been different?
Guess is my
Khalil, you want to kick that one off?
Yeah. So of course, as a good academic, I'll say we'll never know. But as a person willing to take the risk of being called out for making claims that we don't know, I agree with you completely, Marvin. Everything in our understanding of law enforcement's relationship to people of color and Black people in particular around forms of civil disobedience would suggest that there would have been a much more aggressive response and likely more violence directed at protesters in the initial siege of the Capitol, a show of deterrent force to prevent what actually ultimately ended up happening. The simple fact of the scale of people who engaged in an insurrection being escorted out of the Capitol by the end of the day, it's just a remarkable counter story to the ways in which Black protesters, in most instances, had been rounded up into police vehicles and escorted away. I mean, even New York City, for example, in the height of the 2020 George Floyd, was carting away as many people who police officers felt had crossed the line. And ultimately, an Attorney General in New York issued a report saying that the New York Police Department had been heavy-handed in its response to lawful protests in the summer of 2020. So it is what it is in terms of what happened on January 6th. And of course, the consequences of what happened on January 6th in terms of the House committee's investigation, the refusal of Republicans to accept the deliberative process, to participate in it fully in search of the truth, again, suggests to us that we are in a very desperate situation in this country when it comes to the mutual tolerance that the parties should have for each other and willingness to accept certain truths about where we are. Yeah.
I find it very hard to argue with the notion that law enforcement has a racial tinge that would have expressed a different level of enforcement and muscular enforcement if the January 6th protesters had been mostly people of color and especially Black people. I do want to say, for the purposes of trying to understand a little bit of the history and the mindset of the insurrectionists, I wouldn't underestimate the level of state violence that figures into some of the memory and some of the history. So two of the iconic stories in right-wing militia that are actually true are the killing of Randy Weaver by a federal law enforcement in the Pacific Northwest, and the seizure by Janet Reno and the ATF of the Branch Davidian complex in Waco, Texas. And so I don't know how many people, I don't know if you remember how many people were burned up in that ATF siege, but it was about 75 people dead, many of them children. So this is not a small incident of state violence. And so part of the lore and the memory of people engaging in January 6th from the right militia is that they're at war with the federal government, right? And I think it behooves all of us to try to understand some of the points of reference there. There's the January 6th and the immediate aftermath and the people who conducted it, which is a huge source of worry, I think, for anybody who cares about American democracy and democratic institutions. Even more worrisome to me is the mass expression of that. So in the exit polls of the 2022 election, as it turns out that between 3 and 4 voters in the American electorate do not think that Joe Biden was legitimately elected, right? So it's one thing to have a group of political elites denying the legitimacy of the election and a small group of insurrectionists, in this case, in a small fraction of the American population trying to do something violent and illegal about that. Those are very bad. To my mind, a much more worrisome piece is that 3 or 4 out of 10 Americans do not think that the 2020 election was legitimate, right? So that's a mass phenomenon. And unless we can figure out how to change the direction and the dial, both on the elite phenomenon and the insurrection, but then especially on the mass phenomenon of belief in basically counting the votes. I mean, I don't need to color it up with words like legitimacy. We're in some trouble.
Thank you. And our last question comes from Jean Deitch.
Hello, it's Deitch. I appreciate the, it says I can't start my video, but okay. I appreciate the longstanding history of racism that you described, but fossil fuel promoters, the Kochs and others of the oligarchy are creating distension purposely to avert focus on their increasing concentration of wealth. Do you think that we need to focus more on this fact of this increased dissension? I'll stop. You know what the question is. I'll let you answer. We only have a few minutes.
I don't know. I'll just say quickly. I think we've all only ever imagined that we were focusing on more important things than race. Like, we're not a young country. So yes, we had a civil war, but as much as it was about slavery, it was really about two competing visions of an economic system, one mono-agricultural and another one that was industrial capital. And slavery was the fault line that ran between those two issues. The civil rights movement was as much a Cold War project about how we presented ourselves as a liberal democracy in the wake of Soviet and China aggression. And to the extent that we were losing a publicity war with decolonizing countries around the world, Eisenhower and later, first Truman, then Eisenhower, and then later Kennedy decided, we've got to do something about what's going on in the South. And so here we are presented with existential climate threat. And my short answer would be, it doesn't seem to me that we can actually solve climate threat until we solve for racism. We're just not going to get there. People will literally believe in a millenarial view that the rapture is coming soon. And so it's not about man-made decision-making, it's about God's plan. And so you can't break through to a conversation about how people understand the culture that they live in without understanding their own sense of whiteness and Christianity, which is just one part of this problem. I mean, there's plenty of elites that simply either don't believe it's true or figure that they won't be around for the worst of it. And so, but anyway, that's my kind of historical perspective that we actually have to deal with racism in the world. It's not just a US problem, so that we can actually deal with the world since it's on fire.
Yeah, good. Jean, I have a book recommendation for you. I think Khalil also quite likes this book, which is Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. And so the book is a long meditation on an insight that W.B. Du Bois had a long time ago, which I would love the answer to, which is he has this passage about the wages of whiteness and the idea that there are no group of people in the United States who have more in common in terms of their interests than poor white people and poor Black people in the South. But there's no group that has more antipathy toward poor Black people than poor white people in the South. So how do you, to my mind, we're, not just the South anymore, but socially, we're struggling with how to overcome that problem. And Heather's book, the cover of it is a white girl taking a ladder out of a swimming pool and a Black boy jumping off of a diving board into the pool. And the metaphor for her book is that all of these beautiful pools that were built during the New Deal out of the Works Project Administration and others were community pools in the South. And then the Supreme Court says, we have to desegregate these pools. Black people have to be able to use them as well. Black kids have to be able to swim in these pools. And a bunch of communities, white communities, decided to concrete over the pools and fill them up rather than integrate them. And to Heather's mind, and to I think probably all of ours, that's just irrational. How does that make sense in any? And so her puzzle is, well, how can we create a solidarity dividend in which everybody gets a pool and a better pool? And a big part of her answer is, well, you need to think about the concentration of wealth and how to deconcentrate that wealth in order to create public goods that everybody can benefit from. And that is at least her key to unlocking the solidarity dividend. And I think it's a proposition that's very much worth exploring.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I know we're at time, but if you'd like to, in 30 seconds or less to give any final remarks or thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say in my own self-interested way here, speaking to alumni, I think it's worth taking a look around what's been going on at your school. The Kennedy School is making progress on a number of fronts. And in particular, my own work with my colleagues, the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project is an important step in the right direction. The kinds of things that we talked about here today are things that are front and center in our work. And we would love to have your financial support in making a a donation to the IRA project. And if you're so moved and compelled to do so, you can contact the development office or click on the donate button on the IRA webpage, which you can find with a simple Google search or at the ASH Center for Democratic Governance website. So just want to thank you so much for coming out today. And I certainly look forward to meeting some or most of you in person someday.
That's great. And I just want to give a shout out to the excellent work that Ira and Khalil and Miriam are doing, and especially point to this. We didn't really get to talk about this as much, but something maybe we can explore in another webinar. Khalil is one of the leading historians of race and politics in the United States. And part of this conversation is we have to come to grips with our history in order to move forward with more inclusion and equality. And in another part of your work and other projects that Ira is doing, you're exploring like how societies, not just American societies, but other societies come to grip with histories of conflict and injustice. And, I think some societies are good at that and some are bad. Until recently, I think Germany has been good at it. South Africa, kind of good at it. Japan and the United States, like pretty terrible at it. And I don't quite understand why. And I really want to support the work that you're doing in helping us come to grips with our history of injustice so that we can move forward on terms of more justice and equality and democracy moving forward. So thank you to Karen for bringing us together, and Khalil for such a great conversation, and everybody who joined us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.